Archon Valarax stood before the high convocation, her regal crystal form draped in a tattered, blood-soaked Terran jacket that silenced the room. Beneath the jagged fabric, her internal light flickered, struggling to maintain its customary brilliance against the exhaustion of the last 6 hours. One of the elders leaned forward, a chime of disapproval vibrating through his crystalline throat. But the Archon didn't flinch. She simply looked at the council, her silence more terrifying than any declaration of war. How did the galaxy's most untouchable sovereign end up wearing the discarded skin of a lesser species? If you want to see how one human's refusal to accept the math of dying rewrote the laws of the hegemony, join us for the full chronicle. Let's return to the Zenith Spire. 40 minutes before the silence, Kalen Thorne had been standing at the periphery of the gala, adjusting the stiff collar of his Vanguard dress blues to the hegemony. The jacket was an archaic relic, a restrictive armor of mistakes that offered zero mobility compared to their kinetic shield weaves. To Thorne, it was just the heavy wool he'd been ordered to wear while playing the role of a civilized diplomat. He leaned against a pillar of translucent marble, his eyes drifting from the opulence of the floating chandeliers to the Archon herself. Valarax moved with a geometric precision that most found divine, but Thorne noticed the way her facets dimmed ever so slightly when she thought no one was looking. She wasn't just a god, she was a leader nearing her breaking point. The hegemony was built on logic. Every movement in the hall was a choreographed dance of status and protocol, which was why the server caught Thorne's eye. The creature moved with a cadence that was too smooth, too repetitive. It didn't have the micro-hesitations of a biological mind navigating a social space. It was a machine wearing a face, and it was closing the gap toward the Archon with a tray of liquid light. Thorne didn't wait for permission. He didn't check his HUD or signal a Tier 1 security detail hovering in the rafters. He moved. The most dangerous thing in the galaxy wasn't the assassin swarm. It was the human who didn't wait for permission to save a god. Thorne's boots skidded on the polished floor as the server's arm elongated, splitting open to reveal the humming core of a phase shredder. A cloud of molecular nanites hissed into the air, a gray mist designed to unmake the crystal lattice of an Archon's body. The Valarax at full tilt, he tackled her with the blunt force of a species that had spent its evolution fighting gravity and predators. They tumbled across the dais, a chaotic blur of blue wool and shimmering crystal, just as the molecular spray whistled through the space where the Archon's head had been a microsecond before. Thorne felt a searing heat across his ribs. The nanites were eating through the heavy wool of his jacket, biting into the flesh beneath. But he didn't let go. He rolled them toward a maintenance hatch hidden behind a decorative tapestry, kicking the release with a desperate heavy heel. They plummeted into the dark. The maintenance shaft was a narrow throat of conduits and smelling of ozone. Above them, the frantic skittering of the swarm echoed against the metal. Valarax was vibrating, a high-frequency hum of shock that made Thorne's teeth ache. He pressed a hand against his side, feeling the wet heat of blood soaking into his dress blues. He knew the swarm was tuned to her energy signature, a beacon of pure light in the gloom. "Stay still," he whispered, his voice a jagged rasp in the dark. He began unbuttoning the heavy blood-slicked jacket. Thorne worked with a frantic, focused energy. He stripped the Vanguard jacket from his shoulders, the heavy wool steaming where the nanites had begun their work. It was ruined, the gold braid tarnished and the fabric fraying into gray ash. But it was dense. It was organic. It was a labyrinth of thick fibers and Terran blood that the swarm's logic hadn't been programmed to solve. The Archon watched him, her facets pulsing with a rhythmic, percussive light. She was the pinnacle of hegemony evolution, a being of pure, structured energy. Yet she looked small against the backdrop of the churning machinery. He simply draped the tattered jacket over her, pulling the collar high to mask the glow of her core. "Keep it tight," he grunted, leaning his weight against the control panel of a waste-processing turbine. "The swarm tracks resonance. This wool is dead enough to hide you, and my blood is loud enough to keep them guessing." It was a gamble. Terrans were built on the refusal to accept the math of dying. Thorn watched the narrow gap of the maintenance hatch above. The skittering stopped. Her rhythmic thud took its place. The professional hunters had arrived. They didn't move like the server. They moved like predators, their stealth shrouds rippling like oil on water as they dropped into the shaft. Two, he had a waste processing interface and a working knowledge of how much pressure a pipe could take before it became a fragment sleeve. He waited until the first assassin cleared the secondary catwalk. Beneath the floor, something shifted. Thorn slammed his fist into the manual override. A geyser of pressurized coolant and industrial slurry erupted from the vents, a chaotic sludge that coated the stealth suits and stripped away their invisibility. The hunters weren't prepared for the mess. They were used to clean, surgical strikes, not the frantic, unrefined violence of a human in a corner. Thorn didn't use elegance. He used a heavy wrench he'd scavenged from the floor and the momentum of a man who had nothing left to lose. And now, in the tribunal hall, under the silence of 300 species, Valarax finally moved. She reached up and touched the scorched fabric of the Vanguard jacket. The blood had dried into dark, ugly stains against her crystalline skin. One of the council members stood, his voice a sharp frequency of outrage. "Archon, you appear before us in the skin of a primitive? This garment is an insult to the hegemony's standing." Valarax's internal light flared, turning the bloodstains on the wool into a deep, regal crimson. "This garment," she began, her voice echoing with the weight of 1,000 years, "is the only reason the hegemony still has a voice. You see an insult. I see the armor of a species that does not understand the meaning of impossible." 12 empires watched the screen in silence as a crystalline archon draped herself in the blood-stained cloth of a lesser species. The shift was immediate. The Terran delegation, once relegated to the back of the chamber, was suddenly the center of every gaze. They weren't being tolerated anymore. They were being witnessed. Weeks later, in the quiet of a medical bay on an escort vessel, Valarax visited Thorn. He was sitting up, his side wrapped in synth flesh bandages, staring out at the stars. She held the Vanguard jacket in her hands. It had been cleaned, but the scars in the fabric remained jagged holes where the swarm had tried to reach her heart. She laid it across the foot of his bed. The restrictive armor of mistakes had become a relic of a bond that terrified the established empires. Thorn ran a hand over the rough wool. It felt different now. It was no longer a uniform he was forced to wear. It was a symbolic mantle. It was the weight of a debt that could never be repaid, a reminder that in a galaxy of logic and light, sometimes the most powerful thing you can have is a piece of heavy cloth and the will to hold the line. The Vanguard dress blues jacket sat on the bed, a dark shadow against the sterile white of the ship, no longer a piece of clothing, but a legend. How would you react if the survival of your world rested on the shoulders of the person you least expected? We'll be back tomorrow with another chronicle from the edge of the galaxy.